Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line in favor of the Russians. The Russians managed to advance within the Sumy region, advancing within Yunikivka and recapturing a settlement in the northern section of the front line. The Russians also managed to advance across the Sherebets river line in the Liman section of the front line, with additional advances in the direction of Myrnohrad east of Pokrovsk and to the southwest of Pokrovsk within the Dnipropetrovsk region. On top of this, there is interesting information. Looking at a graph from RX, which goes through open source information to check out the losses of both the Russians and the Ukrainians, although there's been a lot of criticism towards RX on the reliability of these numbers, the general trend should be accurate, with the Russians losing a lot of vehicles at the start of the conflict, especially the ones that were abandoned and captured in the first few months of the conflict, following which it was much more damaged, destroyed, and abandoned. But towards the end, the last 10 months, there has been a steady decline in losses of artillery and tanks for the Russians, but especially over the last 6 months, there's been a significant decline in all three losses, especially the IV losses, which were significantly higher than tanks and artillery losses. It has significantly dropped over the past 4 to 6 months. The last 2 months, there is some inaccuracies as it is not completely up to date. Some videos have not been searched through and such, but we can see from 4 months ago there has been a significant drop, especially in artillery. For the past 10 months or so, there's been almost low losses with about 20 losses a month, which is significantly less to the 60 or even 100 losses a month that they claim at the start of the conflict. Now, do these losses mean that the Russians simply do not have artillery, tanks, IVs? Or does it mean that there's no intensity in the fighting? No, it simply means that the Russians have switched to a lot more infantry-intensive fighting and are saving up their armored vehicles and artillery for future operations. The Russians are here building up their offensive capabilities while they are fighting in areas that do not necessarily require infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers. Another point is the fact that the Russians during their offensive operations on the northern flank of Pokrovsk have barely used armored vehicles. Instead, they are mainly using light vehicles, scooters, bikes, motorbikes, ATVs, and similar vehicles that they can mass produce, and provides them the ability to travel quickly, but with no protection or firepower that comes with armored vehicles. The fact that the Russians have switched to this shows two things. The first is, of course, the lack of manpower on the Ukrainian side, which allows them to traverse large areas with almost no resistance. This forced the Ukrainians to redirect forces to this section of the front line to plug those gaps, which will then prevent the Russians from continuing similar operations. But they've already taken areas, now they are looking to consolidate their positions, which again does not require armored vehicles, either the firepower or the protection, but the cover of artillery and FPV drones. In conclusion, what we're seeing is that the Russian summer offensive, or at the end of summer now, the fall offensive, or it will turn into a winter offensive. In either case, the Russian offensive has not begun. They're still in the initial stages of it, where they are clearing the way and creating the necessary requirements for a large offensive. They need to gain control over logistical hubs, and they need to break through the last defensive lines of the Ukrainians here within the Donetsk region, following which they can expand their offensive operations outside of the Donetsk region and in the rear of the Slovyansk-Shentinivka line, and into the rear of the Kharkiv, Dnipro, and Zaporizhia regions, to gain control over the remaining regions in southern Ukraine that the Russians need to gain control of to achieve their goal of the 4 annexed regions in southern Ukraine, including the western bank of the Dnieper River, with regards to Kherson and Zaporizhia. This would require either gaining control over crossings and crossing over the river line, or to gain control over other sectors of the front line and exchange those territories for the remaining parts of the 4 regions. The Russians have clearly signaled that they do not want to achieve a peace without gaining full control over the 4 regions. Therefore, an offensive is expected to come prior to any peace deal, unless Zelensky goes with a peace deal that allows Russians to gain control over the 4 regions, which is extremely unlikely. Therefore, the Russians will likely be making an offensive to gain control over the remaining parts, and the Russians do not plan on extending this war for too much longer, as the economic consequences are still here, and they will continue to intensify. While achieving a peace deal while Donald Trump is still president allows the Russians to have a better opportunity to return to a somewhat normalized economic relation with the West following the war, as the Russians will be able to negotiate a better deal with Donald Trump than really the alternatives for American presidents. Biden, for example, never even wanted to talk to Putin following the start of the war. Moving on to the frontline developments, the Russians managed to advance in the Dnipropetrovsk region in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, getting control over the areas north of Novogeorgivka, to the southwest of Komyshovacha. With the recent advances to the south and to the east of the settlement, the Russians will likely push from the 3 directions to gain control of it, which is the last settlement in the southwestern outskirts, all the way up to Tolstoy and Anderivka-Klevtsova, where the Ukrainians are counterattacking at. At the same time, with the recent push towards Vorona, the Russians continued offensive operations along the defensive lines of the Ukrainians here, along the second line of defense in the Zaporizhia region, entering into the Dnipropetrovsk region. In the Pokrovsk direction east of Myrnohrad, the Russians have gained control over several fortified positions south of the industrial area, west of Novoekonomishna, east of Myrnohrad. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over the areas here east of Myrnohrad to establish a proper supply line into the city for offensive operations going into it, with the flank from the northern direction and control over the waste heap overlooking the city, with control over the river line east of the city and now control over several fortified positions. The Russians are clearing the way to establish themselves within Myrnohrad. Pushing through the city from the northeastern direction will spread out the Ukrainian defenders of Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad to both the eastern and western flanks. This can cause the Ukrainians to concentrate their forces on the flanks, which could allow the Russians to push through the southern flank through the south of Myrnohrad and the south of Pokrovsk, if the Ukrainians redirect too much of their forces to the flanks. However, with the reinforcements, it's likely that they'll be able to cover all of the flanks, but they will keep the Ukrainian reinforcements in the area and prevent them from redirecting their forces elsewhere for future of Russian offensive operations in other sectors of the front line, similar to the western bank of the Sherebets river line, where the Russians continue offensive operations, gaining control over the fortified positions southwest of Kolodyasy and the first patch there, clearing all of the fortifications ahead of the defensive line surrounding Liman from the north and the east. The Russians are pushing through Sarishne and the Kolodyasy direction to gain control over the river line, and with the fighting over the remaining parts east of the Sherebets river line along the Serebryansky forest area, gaining control over the remaining parts east of the river line, getting control of Sarishne and Myrne here along the river line itself, will allow the Russians to start offensive operations towards Liman itself from the northern, eastern and northwestern directions. This is where the Russians would need to deploy armored vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles and tanks to reach Liman itself from the open fields in the northern, eastern and western flanks. The only possibility the Russians have of gaining control over Liman without mass use of armored vehicles would be pushing through the Serebryansky forest area to the east and the settlements to the northwest, where the Russians can move from settlement to settlement, first line to first line, under the cover of this to reach the city, and with cover from artillery and FPV drones, they will be somewhat safe to use light vehicles. This is how the Russians are playing around, using different strategies and tactics depending on the situation and the goals in mind. Russians also managed to advance within the Sumy region in the northern section of the front line, gain control over the southwestern outskirts of Unakivka, leaving just a tiny part of the southeastern outskirts of Unakivka remaining under Ukrainian control, as well as the forest patches and forest lines surrounding the settlement. This will allow the Russians to start using Unakivka as a logistical hub for future offensive operations going further and deeper into the Sumy region. As for Vereshchina, the Russians managed to recapture it following a Ukrainian counterattack, regaining control over the town. Now that the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians out of it again, they have secured the eastern flank of Novomykolaivka and Oleksivka. The Ukrainians continue to pressure the Russian forces in the western parts of the Sumy region. However, the Russians, with the ending stages of the Battle of Unakivka, will be able to significantly strengthen their offensive and defensive capabilities within the Sumy region and start offensive operations towards Sadki and the second line of the defensive positions of the Ukrainians. If the Ukrainians continue their pressure on the Russian forces, they can risk losing a lot of their defensive capabilities during these counterattacks, to which the Russians can take advantage of this and start their own offensive operations, following which the Ukrainians would end up having to redirect forces to this section of the front line yet again, as they'll be expending their forces during these operations. And again, the more that the Russians are able to advance and break through the Ukrainian positions, the more forces the Ukrainians have to direct to the front line, and the less reserves they will have, which will decrease their ability to respond to a Russian offensive should they put their saved up armored vehicles to use. Based on this, we can see that the Russians continue developing offensive operations, mainly doing positional fighting and probing attacks, while the Ukrainians are redirecting their forces to block any gaps that appears in their defensive lines. The Russians are closing in on a siege of Liman, while they are already sieging both Pokrovsk, Kashyantinivka, and Kupiansk in the eastern section of the front line, slowly developing their offensive operations across multiple sectors. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.